There's been a very long and distinguished cartooning tradition in this country over 160 years, so this brief presentation is going to give new meaning to the expression once over lightly. This is really thought to be once one of the very first cartoons in New Zealand, done by James Brown, who was born near Glasgow, apprenticed early as a calico painter and trained as a successful engraver in Dunedin in the 1850s. And these were pen and pencil and wash cartoon prints. This was long before newspapers carried cartoons, and they were very popular in Otago. This one shows the Otago's settlement's founder, Captain Cargill, coming ashore to a rather uncertain welcome. London's Punch magazine began in 1841, and it quickly became popular in the colonies as well as at home. And New Zealand, and that's not that widely known, had no less than 8 or 9 local imitations in the 3 decades from the early 1860s. And it was these were the first publications in New Zealand where cartoons actually appeared. This is Otago, a cartoon in Otago Punch in 1866. And it's a comment on the fact that people down south, which of course were the most prosperous parts of the country at that time, didn't like paying for the land wars in the north. And as you'll see, the humour was very stiff and mannered, and stiff as mannered as the drawings were. There were lengthy captions, and they depended very much in those days, the cartoons, on very heavy-handed puns or complex classical or literary allusions, which fortunately are not used these days because I don't think anybody would understand them. And then there was a new series of weeklies, sometimes but not always tied to the daily newspapers, began in the late 1880s. And these were aimed largely at rural readers, with weekly digests of news and an emphasis on social, sporting and cultural matters. They made use of new photo engraving technology and began to use cartoons widely. And the Observer was one of the most popular, based in Auckland, and William Blomfield, in my view, our first great cartoonist. And when people sometimes embarrassingly ask me who was my favourite cartoonist, I of course don't mention any of the ones that I admire greatly today, like these 3 gentlemen, because I know them all and that would not be a good idea. And I generally say that William Blomfield is, because he was an amazing man. He cartooned for over 50 years. Another who was an excellent cartoonist in those days was E.F. Hiscox, who drew for the New Zealand Freelance, many of you will remember. And he was another cartoonist from that first great era of New Zealand cartooning that coincided with the first reforming Liberal government from 1891. William Blomfield was among the first cartoonists to shrug off that sort of prim, static, relentlessly cross-hatched style of the earlier cartoons. And he did so for the Observer, as I said before, for half a century. Richard John Seddon, the Liberal Prime Minister, dominated cartoons as he dominated politics. And again, people often don't think about this or realise this, but with the first photograph not appearing in a newspaper, it was the Otago Witness, until 1901, the public often saw the politicians in cartoons before they saw them anywhere else. So they formed the view that people had of the politicians. The second great era in political cartooning was during the first Labour government from 35 to 49, and the leading cartoonist was Gordon Minhinnick, a marvellously witty and polished practitioner whose cartoons had a particular edge during this period because he was a conservative and not happy with Labour's radical reforms. I got to know him quite well towards the end of his life, and I had written that this was when he did his best cartoons, which he annoyed him immensely until the last time I saw him in the retirement village where he finally died. He was still arguing that particular period was not his best period, but I've always believed that the best cartoonist is an angry cartoonist, and that's when they have a real edge to their cartoons. And because Minhinnick was basically a kindly sort of man, that it was the way he treated the first Labour government, trade unionists and people like that, that gave a particular effective edge to his cartoons. Because of the lack of opportunities for cartooning in a conservative press in this country, a number of New Zealand cartoonists moved elsewhere. Left-leaning David Lowe, widely considered to be the English-speaking world's greatest cartoonist in the 20th century, is particularly famous for his 1930s and 40s cartoons for the Evening Standard in London, owned by the arch-conservative Lord Beaverbrook. And it was something that worked very well, and something I managed to do many years later with National Business Review, which was aimed at the business elite, who employed a left-wing cartoonist, and it worked marvellously. He thoroughly annoyed our readers every week. And incidentally, these connections, Lowe wanted Menhinnick to replace him at the Evening Standard in 1949, but Menhinnick, although English-born, was very happy staying here, as he did for a half-century, at the Herald. Another excellent cartoonist, George Finey, one of Australasia's greatest caricaturists, and he was on Smith's Weekly in Australia for a long time, and he was one of Australia's highest paid cartoonists. Caricature is an interesting area, and today's outstanding caricaturists include people like Murray Webb, who's eked out a living for decades now with his wonderful political caricatures, and NBR's Bob Rocky, who I mentioned before. Another New Zealander who achieved considerable overseas success was Neville Colvin, who was at Wellington's Evening Post for a decade after cartooning in the New Zealand Expeditionary Forces Times during World War II, and then from the mid-50s cartooned for London's Daily Chronicle, Daily Telegraph, News of the World, Daily Sketch, and Daily and Sunday Express, a lot of the leading papers in London on Fleet Street. Another one was Les Gibbard, who understudied Menhinnick at the New Zealand Herald and was then at 23 the British Guardian's youngest ever cartoonist, and he was cartoonist there for a quarter century. When I've interviewed some of these people and said, why were you so successful on Fleet Street, it was because they understood British history, they'd learnt it at school, but they were not part of the British class system, and they found it much easier to talk about British politics and things in a way that many other people would have been rather more inhibited about. Another Aucklander, a person who did his fine arts degree in Auckland was Alan Moyer, and he did that at Auckland in the early 1970s. And he became has become one of Australia's leading cartoonists, and he comes back and visits regularly. First on the Brisbane Courier Mail, and now he's the Sydney Morning Herald's lead cartoonist. His cartoons are syndicated all around the world. And the Cartoon Archive, which I'm going to say a little bit about shortly, we're bringing him over to Auckland, actually, in a special thing we're doing at Auckland University in May next year, so he's going to be here. The country's third great cartooning era was from the early 1970s until the late 1980s. And where I consider these to be the great eras, it's where you've got excellent cartoonists, but also you've got particularly interesting things happening politically. The first Liberal government, with all its reforms, the first Labour government, and then from the early 1970s to the late 1980s, you had Muldoon, and then you had Rogernomics. And we have three of that time's leading cartoonists still with us, and right here today. You'll see here we've got Peter Bromhead and Malcolm Walker and Malcolm Evans. Oh, that's a cartoon, of course, by Malcolm Walker, who combines cartooning with a very successful architectural practice, and for many years he was the Sunday News cartoonist. Peter Bromhead has been cartooning since the early 1970s, which is surprising considering how young he looks, and was the Auckland Star's editorial cartoonist for 18 years. And he's won about as many Cartoonist of the Year awards as Tiger Woods has won major golf championships.
No, my awards match my redundancies in the industry.
That is true. You might like to say more about that later. Malcolm Evans is a mild-mannered man who is lion-hearted, though, when it comes to points of principle. He has been the New Zealand Herald's editorial cartoonist for two stints. The first ending when he and the paper's pals could not agree on a Bastion Point cartoon, and the second over his attacks on Israel's treatment of Palestinians. Another cartoonist and caricaturist from that third great era of cartooning is Bob Rocky, NBR's cartoonist now for 38 years. And what's really I find fascinating is that having appointed Bob in 1975, because he was a left-wing cartoonist in a paper that was actually middle of the road, but which was aimed at the business elite, basically. Now the newspaper has become extremely right-wing, and the one person who survives from that period is the left-wing cartoonist. And of course, talking about these leading cartoonists, there's Tom Scott, who has had long stints at the Listener, the Evening Post, and the Dominion Post. That's one of Tom's I particularly like, and interestingly, that was Tim Pankhurst, the editor, was telling me that that was not the first cartoon he actually submitted that day. He submitted another one that was a little bit more brutal. It was suggested he might tone it down, and he subsequently agreed that the slightly toned down one was actually, in terms of cartooning and the point it was making, was actually far more effective. Neither the general public nor the academic world knew much about New Zealand's rich cartooning tradition and world-class cartoonists until the unauthorised version sold about 20,000 copies as part of the then Book of the Month scheme, you may remember, in the 1980s. And it was updated again in 1985. And the book provided the stimulus for the New Zealand Cartoon Archive at the Alexander Turnbull Library. Prime Minister at the time, Jim Bolger, launched the Cartoon Archive quite deliberately on April Fool's Day in 1992. And since then, we have collected over 50,000 cartoons, originals and copies, curated 14 exhibitions, held a cartoonist convention that I think all of those gentlemen there were at, organised lecture tours and published 6 books. And 4 of the Cartoon Archives publications, 3 of those have been reprinted at least once. All were associated with exhibitions. The other side of the Ditch exhibition was chosen by the Australian government to celebrate the 20th anniversary of CER in Canberra. That's the one on the top right, and that's a marvellous cartoon, I think, example of one without needing a caption, done by Malcolm Walker. Prior to the first cartoon history was written, standard histories had tended to downplay or ignore racism in New Zealand, in part because we had no official white New Zealand policy in place. Up to this point, historians had not looked at cartoons very seriously, but now they could not ignore the evidence. There was overt racism in cartoons in the 1890s, and again after the First World War, when there were totally unfounded fears of unchecked Indian and Chinese migration. And yesterday we heard Mimi Fitz talking about attitudes towards Chinese earlier on the goldfields, and of course that was something that didn't appear in the official histories, but certainly appeared very strongly in the cartoons. There was also strong anti-Jewish feeling openly expressed, mainly in the years between the world wars, and George Finey, who we've already met, was a regular contributor to the popular Artists Annual that used to be produced in New Zealand. Mostly the New Zealand Cartoon Archive collects political cartoons. That's one of my favourites. That one always gets a good laugh. Most of the New Zealand Cartoon Archive cartoons are on politics, but we also collect social issue cartoons, and there is a very rich vein of social cartoons in New Zealand, and they're, as I say, an important part of our collection. And long-time Dominion cartoonist Eric Heath, so I think, is a very popular and pertinent take on an issue that has certainly not lost its edge. The Cartoon Archive has become, to quote the Chief Librarian, a jewel in the Turnbull Library's crown, as it's made increasing use of by writers, researchers, academics, and it's involved in seminars and conferences. And certainly there's a growing acceptance that cartoons are important historical source material. Now I'm going to go and, that was a lightning look at cartooning in New Zealand. I'm just going to go and sit down with the cartoonists and we're going to discuss a few things. As you'll see, is that coming through all right? As you'll see, the